Thank you, Raymond. We've been talking about a subject on lands for some time. Just this morning I was at the county commission meeting, and it just kind of brought back the reason why we're having this meeting tonight. There was some comments being made in a public address session where some of the people addressed the issue that they thought our county commission was going off in the wrong direction, and fearful that the public lands that are really the state lands, but they're held by the federal government on behalf of the state, that they would be, if they're given to the state, that they would be immediately sold off to the highest bidder and for the money. There's so much wrong about that you can't even begin to start with the list. But the fears that are being promoted by such statements, and statements such as I'll lose my free access to the public lands. Somebody pays. There's no such thing as a free lunch. We know that. Public lands aren't free either. Since here we may use them, we think they're free, but they're not. That issue's been up, and so our group being a group of information and education, and the issue is going on all across the country today. It's a lot of emotion involved in it, and very little fact. And so we said, let's find out the facts. Let's find out the information. Why is it an issue? What is going on? And the American Lands Council is a grassroots group that is in western states that say, let's get together. We've got to save our forests. We've got to keep access in our forests, our public lands. And they have several people that works with them and trying to get information out there, get the truth out, get facts out, and override all this emotion and false information that's being spread around by good-meaning people. But it's false information. As a result, we started, well, who could we get? The American Lands Council. And so, well, we have somebody that is volunteering to help them out, a person that is in the Senate of Montana, that has a professional background. Let me just read it off a little bit here. He says, Senator Jennifer Fielder. And I said, who's that? I'll say, well, I'll tell you who she is. They sent me her bio, and it's on our website. If you haven't looked at it, maybe asked you to look at it if you could. At any rate, Jennifer and her husband, Paul, they live up in Thompson Falls area, a nice forested area, a lot of recreation, a lot of hunting, wildlife. It's got it all. They're at Thompson Falls, Montana. Jennifer holds a bachelor's degree in parks and recreation and coaching, a minor, and she's certified in ski instruction, coaching, horticulture, forest stewardship. That covers just about the whole thing right there in where she's living. For over 20 years, she's specialized in outdoor recreation planning, as well as natural area restoration, landscape development, and project management. Her husband, Paul, is a retired wildlife biologist. They both are avid outdoor enthusiasts who live close to the land. They're routinely engaging in hunting, fishing, trapping, firewooding, plus raising garden and managing their own timberland and optimal forest health for wildlife, habitat, scenic values, and sustainable timber hard productivity. That is what multiple use management we used to hear about. That's what it is, all of those. She was recently, in 2012, was elected to the Montana Senate and serves on the Natural Resources Committee for Fish and Wildlife and Parks Committee and Judiciary Committee, as well as the state's Water Policy Interim Committee and Environmental Quality Council. And she's vice chair of the Montana Republican Party. The 2013 Senator Fielder has successfully sponsored legislation requiring a study to identify and correct concerns associated with management of federally controlled public lands in Montana. That legislation received over 80% approval and ranked as Montana's #2 overall priority with broad participation, bipartisan participation support. We've got somebody that has been there for years working in it, and is very well acquainted with what is the issue, why is it an issue, where do we go from here, what is the facts. Jennifer Fielder, come and give us a background that we can begin to sort out all this junk that we got.
Thank you, Dexter. And thank you for having me here. It's great to be back in Colorado. I graduated from Western State College of Colorado up in Gunnison about 25 years ago, and it's nice to see this country again. It's been a long time since I've been back in this part of the state. My name is Jennifer Fielder, and I am a state senator from Northwest Montana. And I'm here tonight to talk to you about our public lands and for better access, better health, and better productivity on our public lands through shifting from a federal bureaucratic control to a more localized control at the state and local level. A little bit about myself. You've got some information in the bio. I just wanted to show you, this is where I come from now. This is Northwest Montana. All these photographs were taken in the Senate district that I represent, and these are typical photos of the folks I represent. We love our land. We enjoy recreating on the land. A lot of us rely on resources from the land for our livelihoods, and in my family, firewood gathering is one of those important things as far as well as getting our meat from the land and going out and refreshing our souls on this beautiful earth that God created for us. And also my interest in our lands comes as a representative of the people that live in that area, people that live in all the rural areas of the West, because what we found is the problems are pretty much the same across the western states. This is the map of Montana, and the red is the federally controlled land, and that little tiny sliver of white at the end of the arrow is the valley I live in Thompson Falls, Montana. You can see that in that part of the state we are surrounded by literally millions of acres of federally controlled land, and there's very little private land where the people reside, so the management of those lands around us affect our lives every single day. And here you see the map of the entire United States, and this is a proportion of how much federal control there is state by state. And here in Colorado, you're just about 40% under federal control. In Montana, we're just about 30%. And there again, the map of the entire U.S. showing the federally controlled lands and the other lands that are not under the control of the federal government today. When I got elected in 2012, I brought a piece of legislation to start looking at the issues with public land management because we were having some real problems with it in my area of the state. I didn't really know what was going on in the rest of the state or the rest of the country with this. So I brought a piece of legislation that called for a state study of federal land management in Montana. And I was able to achieve 60 co-sponsors on this piece of legislation. Very many tribal members and Democrats and Republicans all supported this legislation. It ended up passing with over 83% approval, very strong bipartisan support, and then it was ranked by the legislature as our #2 priority, so it got moved way up the priority list for attention during the interim cycle for us to take a look at. It was assigned to our Environmental Quality Council as a bipartisan interim committee. Equal number of Democrats and Republicans serve on our bipartisan committees. And that piece of legislation had a few statements in it, and again, these are the excerpts from the legislation that had that very strong bipartisan support. Management of U.S. Forest Service and BLM lands has a significant and direct bearing on Montana's environment, education funding, economy, culture, wildlife, and the health, safety, and welfare of our citizens. This piece of legislation also proclaimed federal funding and capacity for responsible management of U.S. Forest Service and BLM lands are in serious jeopardy, while critical threats such as beetle kills, invasive species, watershed degradation, access restrictions, and catastrophic fires continue to escalate. Again, these are the statements that we made before we even initiated the study. These are the statements that 83% of the Montana legislature already agreed on and knew just from their experiences out there. We started the study during the interim with surveying our county commissioners because, again, I said I didn't know that much about what was going on statewide, but I knew we were having problems in the northwest corner of the state. And so part of the piece of legislation that I wrote called for and required a survey of the county commissioners to ask them what they were experiencing, both good and bad. I wanted to find out what was going on statewide, what was working well, so we could look at those examples and learn from them, and what wasn't working so well, so we would know what problems we needed to try to address. And the results of that survey were astounding. We surveyed every county in Montana that contained 15% or more of its area under federal control. So that was 35 of the 56 counties in Montana. And of those 35 that we surveyed, 28 participated in the survey. So we had a really high return rate. And here are the results of some of the questions we asked them. I don't have time to go through the whole survey, but there wasn't any trend that was more favorable than the ones I'm going to show you. 96% of the counties said that they were experiencing severe catastrophic wildfire conditions on the federal lands within their county, and 79% of the counties reported that there's important habitat at risk because of those conditions on the federally controlled lands in their county. If you just take a look at that, that's from one of our wildfires in the Bitterroot Valley. We also found that 62% of the county commissioners said that air quality in their county falls below acceptable health standards because of smoke originating from the fires on federally managed lands. 62%. What we found in Montana from the people on the ground was that the north-south running valleys tended to hold the smoke longer, and the east-west valleys tended to blow it out, and so that's why you see only 62%. Luckily, there's a lot of east-west running valleys in Montana. I'm fortunate to live in one of those where the smoke and the weather doesn't linger that long. We also found that 64% of the counties said federal land management diminishes water yield for the water supplies that their citizens rely on. And if you take a look at that photo, what that is after a burn. Many of you are probably familiar with the effects of after a big hot burn, but because all the vegetation is burned up, there's nothing there to absorb the moisture. So when you have a heavy rainfall or a snow melt, you get the runoff of all that ash and that burnt soil running down and filling up drainage bottoms, streams. Watersheds are destroyed for decades because of this effect, and it's very, very difficult to restore those watersheds to produce clean water again and restore the fisheries there. And that sludge ends up working its way down into municipal systems, and it's very, very difficult to treat that in the municipal systems. You're talking about millions of dollars in upgrades of your equipment to try to treat this toxic, dirty water that runs down after a heavy fire rainfall. And then 91% of the counties told us that PILT is not equal to taxable land value. PILT stands for payment in lieu of taxes. That's what the federal government gives us because they don't pay taxes on the land, so they give the counties payment in lieu of taxes. That was part of the deal that they made with us when they decided to keep the lands, that they would pay payment in lieu of taxes. And what we found from the states that have studied that is that the payment in lieu of taxes is actually equal to about 13 to 15 cents on the dollar of the actual taxable land value for undeveloped bare land as it sits. So the new vernacular that I hear going around, because there's so many resources on the land and there's so much value there, if you were to manage them correctly, there's so much more value that you could get off the land than what we're getting with the PILT payments. That the new vernacular for PILT is now pennies in lieu of trillions, because literally it is. 96% of the counties also said that motorized access is very important for sustenance activities. We know motorized access is important for recreation too, but I put this question in because so many people do rely on access to the lands for sustenance. For some people it's mushroom hunting, berry picking, hunting wild game, trapping, fur bearers. For others, it's firewood. For many, it's all of the above. We have many craftsmen. I see you've got some nice craftsmen in this area that are making log furniture and things with the resources that come from the dead timber off public lands. 96% said motorized access is very important for sustenance. And 0% of the counties reported that they wanted less multiple-use recreational access routes on the federal lands in their counties. 0%. But has anybody taken a look at the travel management plans that are coming out of the BLM and the United States Forest Service these days? Over the last decade or more, we're seeing every single land management plan that the federal government's been putting out is reducing multiple use access. That's a real problem that a lot of us have been experiencing. In some places, it makes sense to close down some access for good reasons, but we're seeing widespread closures for a lot of reasons that don't make sense. And so these worsening trends are prevalent, and I found not only in my area but across Montana. And as we conducted our federal land study in Montana, we started talking to other state legislatures about what they were doing and what they were dealing with, and we found the same problems in every western state from Alaska to Arizona. Access is being closed down. More worsening trends. This is an excerpt from a federal forest plan, the Kootenai National Forest. It's a plan that I am deeply familiar with. I spent a lot of time reading the plan, commenting on it, trying to work with the agency to put together a better plan that was more responsive and included more input from the citizens. But in the end, they said this about their choice of plan. They said the selected alternative, their choice, their plan, will limit our ability as resource managers to respond to fire, wind throw, insects, and disease, and to provide timber or other commodities. The selected alternative that they were recommending would limit their ability as resource managers to do all these things that they're tasked with, they're supposed to be doing. Very, very strange to come across comments and statements like that in their own plans. And because of that, what we're seeing as a result, and I don't necessarily pin the blame on Forest Service employees or the BLM employees. They've got some very difficult policies coming out of Washington, D.C. to try to deal with. But when they came in and testified during our federal land study, top administrators did come in, and they testified that the national forests are in worse condition today than they were 30 or 40 years ago. They testified that the United States Forest Service is no longer generating positive revenues, and that the Forest Service budget is predominantly allocated to fighting fires and fighting lawsuits instead of managing the resources that they're charged with managing. In some cases, what I've found is up to 80 to 90% of the federal forest budget is being spent on fighting lawsuits and wildfires, and only 10 to 20% is left for actually managing the resources that they're responsible to manage. And it's a real conundrum for the people that are trying to do their job. But you can see some of this management or lack of management and what happens to the timber in places where it gets really thick and overgrown. Trees struggle, they compete with each other. You see drought conditions occur because they suck up all the moisture, they suck up all the minerals, they don't get the sunlight they need, and you see this intense fire hazard in our forests because of that condition. Another worsening trend is that the Forest Service has been managing the forest with the primary goal of avoiding litigation, since they were sued so many times by so-called environmental groups. Many of them I've found that are not really environmental groups, they're law firms that found a way to use the loopholes in environmental laws to sue the agency and be rewarded quite handsomely for the suits. But what we've seen is that with their goal of managing to avoid lawsuits, they're not doing timber management anymore. And these charts here reflect the saw logs taken off of 5 national forests up in western Montana and North Idaho. And you can see back in the 80s, there was quite a bit of timber coming off those forests, and then it took a nosedive in the late 80s, and then early 90s jumped around a little bit. But these last 5 years, 10 years here on the end, since 2005, litigation has slowed down. And I've heard some of the forest supervisors tout that litigation has slowed down, but look at the amount of timber that's not being taken off the land anymore. Look at the amount of activity that they're actually doing in timber management. So that's predominantly why litigation has slowed down, is they're just not taking timber, they're not cutting any trees, they're not thinning forests anymore. And then this is from the National Interagency Fire Center, and this is a chart that shows wildfire acres burned over the last 100 years or so, and you can see the trend in wildfires and the acres burned is increasing quite dramatically here in the last 30 years since these new policies were put into place and started to take effect. And this is a correlation. The red shows the acres burned, and the green shows the saw logs taken off of the forest. So you can see there's more fuel out there, there's less timber being taken off, there's more fuel, and there's more acres being burned. And the wildfires will tell you, or the wildfire fighters will tell you that those areas that aren't being managed are very, very difficult to fight fire in. Once it gets going, it burns so hot that they pretty much just have to wait till it gets to a point where they can actually defend and manage the fire. More worsening trends. The U.S. Forest Service reported in 2013 that there's 10,000 miles of electrical transmission lines at risk on national forests. 10,000 miles in the western states. In Montana, it's about 1,000 miles. You can look up on that report what it is in Colorado. But these are major electrical transmission lines. They're not little power lines. And there's other utilities out there on the public lands too that are also at risk. And they're primarily at risk because of the unmanaged vegetation. And it's not just trees right under the power lines. It's power lines and power towers that topple over after a big fire, and after you get that sludge runoff and you get the erosion and everything, you're actually toppling towers over. So they really are in trouble with many, many miles of power lines in the West. And when they go over, that's going to affect a lot of people's lives. And I want to point out that this is the report that the Forest Service gave to our Public Service Commission, and this is an actual snapshot of the cover. And just, if you read the title of the report, Forest Health and Western Utilities, and then you take a look at the photo they chose to go along with that title, it's pretty telling of what the conditions are out there. It's not just me saying it, and it's not just local people saying it, or state legislator. The federal agency themselves is telling us we have a major problem out there with forest health. More worsening trends. These are quotes right from that report. Fires are becoming larger and more severe. Trends indicate the amount of wildfire and associated damage will increase beyond our recent experiences, and the Forest Service does not have the budget to treat the affected acres. And that again is from the U.S. Forest Service Risk and Reliability Report of August 2013. This is a statement from our governor in Montana, Governor Steve Bullock. He's a Democrat. He says there's a real high degree of frustration when it comes to management of our federal forest lands. He gives this speech to the Western Governors Association, and I just pulled out the key points from his speech, but he reported that we have 6.3 million acres of beetle kill on our national forests in Montana, 4.3 million acres burned in the last 10 years, 5 million acres of declining forest health under imminent risk. Wildlife habitat has been degraded, clean water is endangered, communities' recreation and rural economies are threatened. Washington, D.C. is too polarized, he says, to get anything done. He says they're not really interested in solutions. He says we can't wait for the federal government. It's up to us as western states to bring forth solutions. And he points out that the state model of land management works very well. Before our governor was governor, he was attorney general, and he served on the state land board. We have 5 statewide elected officials that administer our public lands in Montana, our state lands, and he served on that. And he acknowledges there's real bad problems out there. The state model works well. And this was a speech in 2013. But once this idea about transferring the lands to local control started to take hold, he did a 180 on this. And he's now saying that the federal government is the answer and they can do it better, and we can't do it as a state. So it's amazing to see that he's taken a 180, I think for political reasons, because frankly the Republican Party got behind the idea of transferring the land from federal to state control and took an official stance on it, and so then the Democrat Party took the other stance on it, unfortunately. They turned it into a partisan issue, and it really isn't. It affects all of us, no matter what political persuasion you're from. We all rely on clean air and clean water, and we love our wildlife, and we love our beautiful public lands. And the governor goes on to say the urgency is so apparent. But this is the governor's plan, is to work with Congress on the Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill that was passed in 2014 included some special provisions that are going to allow the federal agencies to act quicker on some of the high priority areas. So our governor designated 5 million acres of Montana under high priority, high restoration priority. These are areas characterized by imminent risk to communities, seriously declining forest health, real problematic areas. He designated 5 million acres of our national forests under imminent risk. And in testimony, I asked the Forest Service, with these new provisions of the Farm Bill, how many acres do you expect you can treat next year in Montana, the year you get it up and running? The Farm Bill's passed in 2014. I said, in 2015, how many acres do you expect to be able to treat with this great new tool that you're touting? And they said, well, we think we can get 4,000 or 5,000 acres. And I said, of 5 million? And then I took out my calculator and I did the math. And 5,000 acres out of 5 million is 1/10 of 1%. So at that rate, we're talking about a 1,000-year emergency plan. 1,000 years to treat the urgency under this new provision in the Farm Bill. It's a step in the right direction, but it's not nearly a big enough step. And also we're worsening trends. This is a fire impact estimate from an organization called Smoked Bear. And what they do is they assess the impact to wildlife in terms of how many animals are being burned up in fires and how much pollution is being spewed into the air. And these are very conservative estimates that were put together based on the number of acres burned. And it's estimated that in the 11 western states from 2002 to 2012, we saw 123 million wild animals killed and 4 billion pounds of carcinogenic pollution emitted into our air. And those are minimum numbers. So what's going on is we're seeing federal policies that are failing us. They're not only failing our people and our economy, they're not only destroying life out there, they're wasting resources, locking up our access, and poverty prevalent in many areas of our country. And unfortunately, this is the result of what happens in these wildfires, and a lot of folks don't like to look at that, and they don't want us to show pictures like this. But what do you think happens to those critters that are out there when a catastrophic fire strikes? They can't all outrun it. And there's an awful lot of critters that are really small that get lost in these fires as well. And of course, then fish are smothered. But we can do better, and that's what I'm here to talk to you about tonight. I wanted to give you a little bit of background about some of the problems and the facts that are out there on the land, and the reason I'm so committed to doing something really big to fix this. And it really is the only big solution big enough, and that is to transfer public lands from the federal government to the states so that we can have better access, better health, and better productivity, because the people that live there are more interested in seeing better management than the people that live in New Jersey are. Right? And the key points to this are that the promises are the same. The promises of statehood between those states in the east and the states in the west are the same. We are equal states, all brought into the union on an equal footing. We're with the same rights and responsibilities, but yet we're not being treated equally. But the promises of statehood are the same, and I will show you that. It's already been done before. Millions of acres have already been transferred from the federal government to the states. That's where our state trust lands have come from. It's where in Hawaii, all the federal lands in Hawaii except military were transferred to the Hawaiian state, and I'll show you that. And it really is the only solution big enough. It's the only solution big enough to solve these problems, to help us better educate our kids, better take care of our environment, get people back to work, the right of local governments, better decision making that's customized to the local community, customized to the people that are affected by those decisions. And really, knowledge and courage are the key. So I'm glad you're here tonight to learn about this. It's kind of intense information I'm about to get into, so I really need you to try to focus, really try to focus on this, because this is like a kind of like a PhD course in about 4 subjects you're about to touch on here. But I'm going to go through some of the myths, and that's how I'm going to address facts. And the myths that we hear about this idea of transferring public lands to the states are, first they say you gave up your lands. Some of them say it's unconstitutional to govern your own lands. Others say it's just impossible, we can't possibly do it. Some are saying nobody supports it. What we hear a lot is you can't afford it, you states couldn't possibly afford it, and you'll close it or you'll sell it. That's the biggest fear factor out there is you'll sell it. And we'll go through these points point by point and show you that all of those myths are indeed myths and they are absolutely wrong. Number 1, you gave up your lands. Well, the fact is only temporarily. Now I'm going to start with some history here, and this is the governor of Wyoming in his inaugural address when Wyoming became a state. 1889, he says, "State of Wyoming will, after the date of admission, receive 5% receipts from all sales of U.S. lands within its borders, which will continue until all such lands are sold." Why would Governor Warren say this? Why would he say this? I'll tell you why. The Statehood Enabling Act is one reason. When the states came into the Union, we all had an enabling act. This was an official act of Congress that allowed a state to become a state. It was based on an agreement between the federal government and the state government. And that enabling act has a few key clauses in it that are important to know. And there's many other documents that support what I'm telling you here, and I will show you some of those as well. But the 5% clause that Governor Warren was talking about, this is Section 13 from the Statehood Enabling Act. It's in the Montana Enabling Act, Washington, Idaho, North Dakota, South Dakota, Colorado. It's in pretty much all the enabling acts, almost verbatim the same, east and west. And Section 13 says that 5% of the proceeds of the sales of public lands lying within said states, which shall be sold by the United States, shall be paid to the said states to be used as a permanent fund, the interest of which only shall be expended for the support of common schools within said state. So what they're saying is, whenever the federal government sells lands, 5% of the proceeds will go to the state. A little interesting side note, I found that they haven't been paying us. So I brought a piece of legislation this last session here in the spring, and it got passed through our legislature, and it requires our Attorney General to recover our 5% that they owe. In Montana, the Forest Service has sold 70,000 acres to private interests and not paid the 5% to the state. I don't know about the other agencies yet, but we're going to be doing an investigation on that and sending them the bill. And I think you're probably entitled to that as well. Same language as in your Enabling Act. Yep, there it is, Colorado, 1875, same exact language. And that's Section 12 of your Enabling Act. Ours is Section 13. Same exact language. Oh, except that for us, the 5% was to go for support of common schools, and for the state of Colorado, it says for the purpose of making such internal improvements within said state as the legislature thereof may direct. So you have more flexibility on what to do with your 5% than we do. And then this is another key section from the Statehood Enabling Act, the Quit Claim Clause. And this part is kind of interesting because it says that the people inhabiting said proposed states do agree and declare that they forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public lands lying within the boundaries thereof. But you see that comma there that's circled? There's a comma there, and there's a rest of the sentence. And some of the legal so-called scholars that are opposed to this idea of transfer, they all put a period right there. Whenever they cite this part of the Enabling Act, they always put a period right there. But if you look at the Enabling Act, there is a comma, and the sentence goes on. And it continues that until the title thereto shall have been extinguished by the United States. So why did they put the comma, and why did they finish the sentence with that we forever disclaim all right and title until the title thereto shall have been extinguished? It was basically a quit claim clause, giving the federal government clear title so they could dispose of the public land, so they could sell it or grant it or open it up for homesteading or whatever, but they were supposed to divest of title of the public land and allow the people in the state to obtain that land, and then whatever was left over was supposed to go to the state. And here's a comparison side by side of the Colorado and North Dakota Statehood Enabling Acts. Again, it's virtually the same language. I don't expect you to be able to read that, but I just wanted to throw it up there so that you can see that the enabling acts from the eastern states are the same as the enabling acts from the western states. Virtually the same terms of statehood. So why the difference? Why do the eastern states control 95% of the lands within their boundaries, but the western states on average control less than 50% of the lands in our boundaries? That's the big question. Why the difference? Why are we being treated different? In fact, this is going back even a little bit further, the Territory of Montana Organic Act. This is the federal territory. And in that act, it says no law shall be passed interfering with the primary disposal of the soil. And it also says lands in the said territory shall be surveyed under the direction of the government of the United States, preparatory to bringing the same into market. So again, this is supporting this whole notion that the federal government would be divesting of title. And this was in the territorial acts back in the 1860s before we became states. And that's in the Montana one, but the same exact language is in the Territory of Colorado Act as well. So this was common across all the states. When they were territories, the federal government was preparing to bring the land into market. They were surveying it for that purpose. And when they became states, they promised that they would dispose of title and pay the states 5% for anything they sold. And there were hearings on this because the federal government wasn't giving up the land in the West, not in a timely fashion. And so Congress started to hold hearings on it. And you can see this document here, and if you look at the title at the top of the page, it says, Granting Remaining Unreserved Public Lands to States. That's what the hearings were about in 1932. We have some good documentation from these hearings, which is some of it I'll share with you from your representative from Colorado. But the states ended up rallying to kill this piece of legislation because the federal government decided that they were going to hold on to the mineral rights. And the state said, no, you have to keep the whole promise. It's the land and it's all the rights that go with the land that are to go to the states. In fact, this is Colorado's official position to Congress, and this was in considering that bill that I just showed you. We contend that in equity and justice, all of the unappropriated lands belong to the state, and that the federal government is simply holding title as a trustee until such time as the state is properly organized to take over and properly administer the same. 1932 congressional hearings. That's your representative from the Colorado State Board of Land Commissioners in Congress. He also said this statement, it's not just the man, he's representing the land board for Colorado. They also said that the state is entitled to and should receive not only the surface rights of these lands, but the subsurface as well. The statement also said, we believe that the state of Colorado can administer these lands and conserve their natural resources to a better advantage than a bureau with headquarters in Washington. The moment responsibilities of any community are shifted from any part of the nation to Washington, then that community has subjected itself to a remote bureaucracy with its minimum of understanding and sympathy. It has lost a large part of its voice and its control of its own destiny. Back in 1932. And again, the statement also continued on, when authority is located afar off, it is necessarily less well informed, less sympathetic, and less responsive to public requirements. When it is close at hand, it is more likely to be executed in the public interest. So you see, this idea of the land being transferred to the states is not a new idea. It's an idea that's been around for a long time, but we just haven't got it done in the West yet. The eastern states did it, though, and also Hawaii did. The Taylor Grazing Act came into enactment a couple years later, 1934, and again, the first paragraph of the Taylor Grazing Act says to promote the highest use of the public lands pending its final disposal, ... and then the Secretary of Agriculture is authorized to create these grazing rules, but to promote the highest use of the public lands pending its final disposal. So this idea that the lands weren't meant to go to the state is completely flat wrong. And in Hawaii, their Enabling Act was put into place in 1959, and I think they saw what was going on with the struggle of the western states to be able to get control of the lands they were promised. So Hawaii included even more specific language in their Enabling Act, ensured that it was more specific, and so their Enabling Act says the United States grants to the state of Hawaii, effective upon admission into the Union, to the United States, title to all the public lands and other public property within the boundaries of the state of Hawaii, title to which is held by the United States immediately prior to its admission into the Union. The United States grants the state of Hawaii title to all the public lands and other public property within the boundaries of the state of Hawaii. But still, the federal government wouldn't relinquish the land, even though that language was in the Enabling Act. When Hawaii was ready to take over the land, federal government resisted. Hawaii took them to court. What happened in 1976 is Congress declared they have a new policy, and their policy is no longer that of disposal. Now their policy is that the United States, that the public lands be retained in federal ownership. So they went from this policy of disposal, and it really wasn't a policy, it was a law. It was a bilateral law, an agreement. Now they're declaring this policy that the land will retain in federal ownership. But the question here is, can Congress change the terms of statehood with a new unilateral policy? We'll answer that question. The U.S. Supreme Court in the Hawaii case in 2009 ruled in a unanimous decision that the consequences of admission are instantaneous. It ignores the uniquely sovereign character of that event to suggest that subsequent events, i.e. acts of Congress, somehow can diminish what has already been bestowed. And that proposition applies a fortiori with even greater force where virtually all of the state's public lands are at stake. This is the decision that got Utah going to pass legislation to demand the transfer of federal lands to the state. This decision was discovered by, I believe it was the Office of Public Instruction in Hawaii brought this to the legislature and said, look what happened in Hawaii, because they're having trouble funding their schools in Utah. And they know that with good public land management, you can provide more funding for your important institutions, including schools. So that's where this idea came from. It was brought forward to the legislature, and it was Representative Ken Ivory that carried the bill in Utah to demand the transfer, and that successfully passed and was signed into law. And now Utah is working with other states to help educate them. The American Lands Council was born of county commissioners and elected state representatives working together to try to bring this information out and compel Congress to honor the promise. Here's some more statements from the U.S. Supreme Court that back up what I'm telling you here. And this was in 1980. The Supreme Court ruled that enabling acts are solemn compacts and bilateral two-way agreements that are to be performed in a timely fashion. Solemn compacts, bilateral two-way agreements. A two-way agreement, a contract, think of it. You've entered a contract, you probably all have. Can one person, one party of that contract change it without the consent of the other one? When you have a contract, it takes both parties to change it, right? And that's what the Statehood Enabling Act, it's basically a contract or a compact. You can look up the definitions in the legal dictionaries. Same type of thing. A compact carries more weight than a contract. It's a solemn compact. And the other decision there back in 1890, the federal government holds territorial lands in trust for the several states to be ultimately created out of the territory. Solemn compacts, bilateral agreements. And then if you look at the U.S. Constitution itself, what does it say? Article 4, Section 3, Clause 12. Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. It doesn't say Congress has the power to keep the land forever and ever and ever, does it? Why do you think they wrote it that way? There's so much history I could share with you from those older documents, from the congressional hearings, from the Constitutional Convention. The language and the discussions around this was a very big subject for our fledgling federal government. So it's funny that the second myth is it's unconstitutional for the federal government to transfer the land to the state. Actually, read the Constitution and all those other cases I just showed you, which were United States Supreme Court decisions. Clearly, it's not unconstitutional to have the federal government follow the Constitution. U.S. Supreme Court, 1845. The United States never held any municipal sovereignty, jurisdiction, or right of soil in the new states except for temporary purposes. Temporary purposes. This is an interesting document I think you'd like to see. I would have brought it if I had known you were so focused on the Constitution. This is a document that's put out by Congress about every 10 to 15 years, as I understand it. It's the United States Constitution annotated. And what they do is they go through every clause of the Constitution and they make a statement about that clause based on the Supreme Court decisions dealing with that clause. So it's organized clause by clause, and it has the Supreme Court citations there that back up what they're saying about that clause, providing more detail. And this was in the 1938 edition that I received. It's about that thick, and dealing with new states. And this is Article 4, Section 2. And it says the right of every new state to exercise all powers of government which belong to and may be exercised by the original states of the Union must be admitted and remain unquestioned except so far as they are temporarily deprived of control over the public lands. United States Constitution annotated, published by Congress by official congressional resolution. That's the 74th Congress, second session, document number 232, page 539. And then there's been some law reviews starting up. The real legal scholars are very interested in this issue for a variety of reasons and from a variety of angles. But this is just an example of one of the white papers that's been put out. This is a peer-reviewed white paper that was published by the Federalist Society, which is an organization nationwide. Over 40,000 lawyers, law students, scholars, and other individuals are members of this institution. And in a nutshell, that document says the legal arguments in favor of the Transfer of Public Lands Act are serious. This was put together back in 2013. Utah passed their Transfer of Public Lands Act in 2012, so this is one of the first legal opinions that came out about it. There's many, many more. And then there's this other myth that it's impossible, it's already been done before, is the fact. It really, truly has already been done before. I'll show you a little bit of history on that. These states that are in the red here, the old, what were called Western states at the time, were as much as 90% federally controlled also, because they were states carved out of federal territory just like we were. Western states, Illinois, Missouri, Indiana, Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida were as much as 90% federally controlled for decades. And it was one man who led the charge to change that. His name was Thomas Hart Benton. He was a United States Senator, Democrat, from the state of Missouri. And this is one of the statements that he made about it. He made many speeches about it and rallied the states and rallied the people to get Congress to honor the promise of statehood. And he was successful. It took him some time. It took 20 or 30 years back then, but he didn't have a cell phone. He didn't have airplanes. And he didn't have YouTube and internet. So hopefully we can get it done faster than he did. But it has been done before. Those states were as much as 90% federally controlled, and today they're less than 5% federally controlled. And I like this statement that he makes here. He says, the federal government became the monopolizer of vacant lands, and this monopoly, like all monopolies, resulted in hardships to those upon whom it acted. And you know what? Even Canada has done this. They say it's impossible. It's already been done before. It's been done in all the states east of the Rockies. It's been done in Hawaii, and it's been done in all of Canada too. So it's not that new of an idea, and it's not that groundbreaking of an idea. It's amazing that the response that we're getting from people saying that it's impossible and it's never been done and it can't be done. Well, in Canada, what they just did was they completed a full transfer of federal land to the Northwest Territories. They did it last year. It was just about a year ago. It was in April of 2014 when they completed it. But it was a full transfer, and they worked out an amazing agreement. They worked on 10 years to get the agreement in place so that it would be an orderly transition. But what they agreed on was that all the federal control of the land would be turned over to the territorial government, the Northwest Territories. They also have regulatory control of the lands and resources, environmental regulations and so forth. The feds are actually paying the Northwest Territories to manage the lands. All the money the federal government was spending on land management is being block granted to the local government so that they can manage. The local government hired all the federal employees to go to work for them. So all those federal employees went to work for the Northwest Territories. All the federal funds went to the Northwest Territories. It's paying those once federal employees that now work for the new boss, the Northwest Territories, and they're splitting the proceeds of resource development 50-50. So whatever they are able to generate from resource development, the federal government gets half, the Northwest Territories keeps half, and actually of the half the Northwest Territories is keeping, they're giving 25% of that to the tribal governments, and they're working really well with the tribal governments there and with the local government and with the federal government, and they're seeing much better results in terms of stewardship, environmental care, and natural resource production. They did leave control of the really hazardous areas with the federal government. The areas that were in really bad condition on federal watch, the liability for those was left with the federal government to clean those up. And once they're cleaned up, then those will transfer to the local government as well. And one of the quotes, the money quotes there from the lead negotiator of the Northwest Territory who came and testified to us in our federal land study in Montana, he said, "You tend to get better decisions from those closest to the subject matter." Everybody realized it, and they came up with this agreement that worked. And then another myth is that nobody supports it, and this one's rather funny, actually, because there's actually been legislation introduced in nearly every western state now to either study or call for the transfer of public lands to the states. And states that are working on it right now, Utah's already passed legislation. Nevada 2 years ago passed legislation to order a study commission. Wyoming this year passed legislation calling for a study, appropriating funds to conduct a feasibility study on how they can go about doing this. Idaho set up a study commission. Montana did our federal land study and introduced legislation for the lands. We tried to set up some things to study it and also to put provisions in place to ensure that the lands can't be sold after they're transferred to the state, and we'll get into that. But legislation and efforts are underway in all these states, not only in the West, but also eastern states are starting to support us too. So we've seen legislation introduced and passed in states like South Carolina, Tennessee, Florida, New Hampshire, Oklahoma. Several states in the West, Georgia, I believe, have either introduced or passed legislation favoring the western states getting control of our land. The states are uniting. This is a picture in a caucus room in the Utah State Capitol, and that's representatives from just about every western state. There was a couple that couldn't be there because of scheduling conflicts with their session, but state representatives and state senators from nearly every western state are getting together and talking about, should we do it? That was the discussion in that room at that time. And if so, what's the strategy? How do we go about it? How do we move this forward? What precautions should we take, and so forth? What kind of obstacles do we expect to run into? And even Congress is working on now trying to get these lands transferred to the states. We've seen resolutions of support come from the Republican National Committee. This was passed in 2013, unanimously supporting the state acquisition of the federal lands for local management. We've seen resolutions of support in Montana. It was also passed unanimously by our Republican Party. And if you know anything about the Republican Party, you know we usually don't agree on anything, but we had unanimous resolutions of support on this issue at both the national and state level. And it's not just a GOP thing, though, and it shouldn't be. It really doesn't matter what party you're in. These lands affect us all, and that's why we're seeing cities, counties, states, school districts, education associations, trade unions, chambers of commerce, economic councils, user groups, and so forth get on board with this idea. We're seeing support bubble up from every sector of society. Support is growing every single day. This support statement came from Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife. We're seeing resolutions of support from Farm Bureau, cattlemen's associations, etc. And we're happy to see resolutions of support from any organization that you're affiliated with as well. You can bring this idea forward and ask them to make a statement or obtain more information before they do. This was a statement that came from our joint chambers of commerce in Montana. All of our major cities put this into their joint position papers in 2012. And this is one that the National Association of Counties, this is all the counties in America, voted to support this resolution calling for the immediate transfer of public lands to the states. And of course they included special language in there that emphasizes the importance of the state working with the counties on this to make sure that they're coordinating their efforts. South Carolina, Georgia, Arkansas, Tennessee. They say nobody supports it. There's a lot of people that support it, and it's growing every day. And then Congress formed this working group in April of this year called FLAG, Federal Land Action Group, and they are investigating a framework for transferring public lands to local ownership and control. They're exploring the legal and historical background to determine the best congressional action. A couple quotes there from their press release on why they're doing it. The federal government's been a lousy landlord and so on. And then they say that we can't afford it. This is another myth. You can't afford it. Well, fact, states have been outperforming the federal government ever since we took over public land management, ever since millions of acres were transferred to the states. In Montana, it's 5 million acres of public trust lands that we manage. We've got a former state trust land manager here with us tonight in Dexter. He's very familiar with how well states manage land, and they do it in a way that makes money for the state and supports institutions, especially schools, is where a lot of that funding goes. There was a report done by Property Environmental Research Center recently out of Bozeman, Montana, and they just took the data straight from the federal government and the state governments and showed that for every dollar the federal government spends on land management, they lose 27 cents, whereas states generate $14.51 for every dollar we spend managing lands. And this was based on a 4-state model looking at public land management in Montana, Idaho, New Mexico, and Arizona, and comparing similar lands to the Forest Service and BLM lands. More economic data just showing how much money the federal government is losing and how much money the states are actually gaining through good resource management. A few more charts here. But we know that wise resource management produces revenues. And also some information that's important to note here. There's $150 trillion in minerals locked up on federal lands. $150 trillion locked up on federal lands. Now, imagine if we could access 1% of that. Just 1%. How far would 1.5 trillion go in the western United States or in the entire United States? Pretty darn far. $6 billion of timber value, sustainable, harvestable timber value on federal lands in Montana. What we're seeing is outdoor recreation is a multi-billion-dollar industry now, but it's directly impacted by the access and by the wildfires and the conditions on federal lands. So it's very, very harmed when we have huge wildfires or access closures. And then we're seeing wildfires greater than 250 acres occurring on the federally managed land. It's almost a mirror image of federally controlled lands and the amount that's actually on fire, continuously large fires. But what we learned is that for every dollar spent on wildfire fuel reduction, you can save $17 on firefighting costs. That was a study that came out of Colorado after your big wildfires a few years ago. And that every dollar spent on wildfire fuel reduction, in other words, managing the vegetation, every dollar you spend on that saves $450 to $500 in total destruction, total damages when you account for all the lost value, the damage to property, the damage to the environment, and so forth. Unwise resource management produces debt, and I don't probably have to tell you folks this, but this is a chart of the national debt from 1940 to present, and you can see it just astronomically increasing. It was doing pretty good up through 1980, though. If you look at the arrow I've got there, up through 1980, it wasn't too bad. But when we stopped managing our resources wisely, this is what happened, and I'm not saying that's the only reason for it, but that's a big part of it. Then there's this other myth that you'll close it. Does anybody remember the shutdown? Who closed it? Washington, D.C. closed it. Congress had a squabble over health care, funding for health care, and so they couldn't agree on a budget, and so the president decided that all non-essential public services would be halted and all non-essential employees would be sent home, and they closed every national park in the country. They shut down every acre of public land in the country except for golf courses. Those stayed open. I wonder why. But the Grand Canyon closed. Yellowstone National Park closed. Hunters were tracked down in the backcountry. It was archery season in Montana when this happened. It was early October of 2013. The federal government employees to the backcountry to make these guys break camp and tell them they had to leave because federal government was shut down. People that never would have known. Hikers on the Pacific Crest Trail, places that are unsupervised. They don't require supervision. And it's not about search and rescue being able to get to these people if there's a problem. Search and rescue is local. Search and rescue is run by your county. So it was the federal government that shut it down. It's the federal government that's closing access consistently. And that's one of the reasons that there's so much support building for this movement for local control. This is a photo from a little walk that I was taking last fall, and my husband and I were walking along, and he was saying, and this is a gated road you can't drive in on, so you have to walk and climb over the timber, and he made the comment that, boy, if I could just get a pickup in here, you know, we'd have a firewood supply for the entire winter. And it would have opened the road so that it would have helped maintain the road. But access is being obstructed, and we're actually seeing access being deliberately destroyed, not just gated. Now this decommissioning, they call it, where they're actually obliterating the roads. And this is actually a pretty gentle looking photo of road obliteration, but what we're seeing as a result is we're seeing so much debris that gets piled on the road afterwards. They're making it so that it's impassable to foot traffic, and that's actually a mandate in the travel management plans, that some of this decommissioned roads have to be put into a condition where they're impassable even to foot traffic. And who's selling it? They say you're going to sell it. Who's selling it? Congress is already selling it. They have sold it. They're in so much debt that they're looking to sell more. This was a bill that was introduced, I believe it was 2013. Yeah, it's called the Disposal of Excess Federally Managed Lands Act. This is a federal act of Congress that was introduced and passed through the House Natural Resources Committee to sell off large tracts of Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, and Wyoming. And we don't know where. And we're not involved in the decisions. We don't know if it's in our community. We don't know if it's in our county. This is just a decision Congress is making based on some old documents they have from when these lands were deemed suitable for disposal. And I've tried to figure out where the land is, and all I've been able to obtain are legal descriptions, no mapping. So I don't know where they're at even in my state. And I'm the chair of federal land management studies in my state. And just this year, May, this month, Representative from Texas introduced what he called the American Lands Act, which would require the Forest Service and BLM to start auctioning off the land 8% a year for the next 5 years. So 40% of the land. This is an act that was just introduced in Congress. So who's selling it? It's not the states calling to sell it, it's Congress. But I want to show you this. This is a 3-minute video, and this will show you who's trying to keep public lands public and who's not. I introduced legislation in Montana this year to make sure that we would keep the public lands public after they're transferred to the state. And here's what happened. Do we have that?
My name is Jennifer Fielder. I'm a state senator from Northwest Montana, District 7. Today, members, I bring Senate Bill 215, which would prohibit the state of Montana from selling any lands that may be transferred to the state from the federal government in the future. There's no question in my mind that most of us agree that the public lands should remain public. So this bill would place into statute the prohibition against the state selling any public lands that may be transferred from the federal government to the state of Montana in the future. There's actually been quite a debate about the transfer of public lands, and a lot of the debate has revolved around a assertion that the state would just sell the lands off. So this bill, I think, exercises our voice as the representatives of the people of Montana, that we do not want to let that happen, that we want to make sure that public lands are kept public.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Clayton Elliott, E-L-L-I-O-T-T. I'm here today representing the members of the Montana Wilderness Association. Unfortunately, we rise to oppose Senate Bill 215 today.
Mr. Chairman and committee members, my name is Nick Gvock. That's G-E-V as in Victor, O-C-K. And I'm here on behalf of the Montana Wildlife Federation. We rise in opposition to this.
My name is Jake Troyer, and I'm here to represent the over 5,200 members of Montana Audubon. We urge to not pass on Senate Bill 215.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Ben Lamb, and I am representing the National Wildlife Federation. Just a hearty me too from us.
This is a simple bill. It prohibits the state from selling any land that may be transferred to it from the federal government in the future. puts that in statute. Now, if you believe in keeping public lands public, you should support this bill. I'm quite surprised that the Montana Wilderness Association, the Montana Audubon Association, and the Montana Wildlife Federation, who are sponsoring a rally in this capital a week from today, a rally to keep public lands public, came in today and testified against keeping our public lands in public ownership. For the record, I think that shows that there's some disingenuous information being circulated about to scare the people of Montana about this issue. And I thought that for sure they would be here supporting this bill today if they did truly believe in keeping public lands public. So there's a conflict there that they're going to have to explain to their memberships and to the public next week. Mr. Chairman, the bill is simple. It prohibits the sale of any lands that may be transferred to the state in the future.
So who spun the myths? And this didn't occur just in our capital. I think it occurred in every capital that was considering even conducting a feasibility study on the subject. Our feasibility study would have required the state to operate under the assumption that the public land would remain public and could not be sold, and it would develop safeguards that could be put into place to ensure that the lands were managed according to the values that Montanans share. And they came in and opposed that study, and they held this rally saying we were just there to try to sell it off. And if you want to know, if you want to follow the money trail, I recommend you go to greendecoys.com. You can follow the money trail there, but it's basically radical environmental groups are starting now to use sportsmen's groups as camouflage to push their agenda, and they're raising money. They're doing this to raise money. They're telling sportsmen that we're going to lock up the land and we're going to sell it off so the sportsmen will rally and send funds to their green decoy organizations. Green decoys meaning environmentalists, neo-environmentalists in sportsmen's, in camouflage. So who spun the myths? Started with green decoys, but it didn't end there. The public lands debate has been marred by camouflaged activists, not just environmental organizations or more like neo-environmental organizations, because really what they're doing isn't helping the environment, but it is raising a lot of money. This is a Facebook post from Clayton Elliott. He's the director of Montana Wilderness Association, and he put this picture up of the public land rally. Again, he was one of the gentlemen that testified in the hearing opposing the bill that would keep public lands public, but he was one of the organizers of the rally, and then he put this post up on his Facebook page about a week after the hearing when he was in there opposing the bill to keep public lands public. He goes to the rally a week later, puts this post on Facebook calling, if you see the hashtag there, it says keep it public. You know, so that's what they're telling everybody, is they're trying to keep it public, but yet they're opposing keeping it public. So why would they do that? Well, they're raising a lot of money off telling people that they're going to be the ones that save the land and keep it public, and that we're the bad guys because we just want to take it over and sell it off. And that's not true at all. And I have to put this up because also after the hearing, towards the end of the legislative session, the Democrat Party in Montana sent out this fundraising email saying that Senate Bill 215, Senator Jennifer Fielder's bill to transfer and sell Montana's public lands, was the winner for the worst bill of the session. I won an award for the worst bill of the session. And you just saw the hearing on Senate Bill 215. Senate Bill 215 was to prohibit selling the public lands, and they're saying it was a bill to transfer and sell Montana's public lands. Outright bald-faced lie. And then the tag down there at the bottom says, will you help us kick Senator Fielder out of office and elect pro-public lands Democrats in 2016? So they're using it as a campaign tool. And again, here is the bill. Here is a copy of the bill. You can look it up in the Legislative Archive, Senate Bill 215, an act entitled, an act prohibiting future sales of land granted or transferred to the state. No way to misconstrue what that bill did. Simple one-page bill. The truth is, I want better access, health, and productivity on public lands, don't you? I do, and that's why I'm so involved in that. That's why I volunteered to come down here today. That's why I'm volunteering to go all over the country and share this with folks. I want better access, health, and productivity on our public lands, and I believe that the states can and will do it better. This is a public policy statement that was put together by members and guests of the American Lands Council that gathered for a national conference last October. We wanted to let people know exactly what it was we truly wanted to do, and so we put together a public policy statement. There was about 100 elected officials and resource experts that gathered and worked on this until we agreed on every single word of it and passed this unanimously. The public policy statement is available on the American Lands Council website, but the top 3 points: we urge the timely and orderly transfer of federal public lands to willing states for local control that will provide better public access, better environmental health, and better economic productivity. And we are working on legislation to ensure that's what happens. We support excluding existing national parks, congressionally designated wilderness areas, Indian reservations, and military installations from the transfer. So we're not talking about wilderness, and we're not talking about national parks. We're talking about the lands that were supposed to be managed for multiple use, sustained yield with local planning that aren't being managed that way anymore. And we support equipping federal, state, and local agencies with the resources necessary to plan for a successful transition to state-based ownership and management of the transferred public lands. So we're not talking about an overnight shift. We're talking about working together with our federal partners to get this done. And you can see down there, this is just part of the public policy statement, but if you look down to the bottom statement, that's a pretty key statement in there, number 4.4, retain public ownership of public lands. Federal public lands shall become state public lands to be managed in accordance with state and local plans. That's what we're after. So why transfer lands? Just to wrap this up, we would like to see a reduction in wildfire threats. Why transfer lands? To protect our environment. Why transfer lands? Protect our wildlife. Why transfer lands? Keep our access open. Why transfer lands? Revive our economy. Instead of closed access, you have open access. Instead of timber burning, you have timber being put into merchantable products. And why transfer lands? Last but not least, placing stewardship of public lands in better hands. That's really what it's all about, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you'll join us. I hope you'll join the American Lands Council. Look at the publication that was put out today. Ask questions. Learn about it. Spread the word. Share this information. There's no question that can't be answered about this. It's just a matter of where there's a will, there's a way. If we want to get this done, we can. And the movement to do so is growing exponentially every day. That's why we're seeing millions of dollars being spent now by the opposition to oppose it and to spread the kind of lies that you just saw documented here in this presentation today. But for more information or to help make better public land management happen, please visit the American Lands Council .org website and sign up and join us. I'd be happy to stick around and answer questions. Thank you.
Just real quick, reiterate just a little bit. Jennifer is here voluntarily. She's donated her own time. She's really not even a member of officially of them because she's a state senator, and it works a lot better that way. But she is so, I guess you say, engrossed and so passionate about what they are doing that she's joined with them. She's volunteers her time to go along with the objectives the American Lands Council has to save our lands, save our forests, save our wildlife, and our access, and save our state's economies, basically more jobs that we can afford to even go out and recreate. If you do have a few questions, she is open, or you want to do it publicly, or we can just break up and you can buttonhole her, which might work the best. Any right off the bat, Jim?
promoting the sale of public land. What is the big money behind you? Have you got North Forest giving you a couple billion dollars?
So just for the record, the question is, there was a statement made in the local paper that there's big money behind this and that it's some nefarious type of ulterior motive to get the land and sell it. No, there's no big money behind this. It's a small organization. It was founded by county commissioners, ranchers, and it was a state legislator in Utah that independently came up with the idea. When he started looking at that case from 2009, the Supreme Court decision that the Public Instruction Office discovered in Hawaii's case, and that was Representative Ken Ivory that introduced legislation to demand the transfer of federal lands to the state. And these county commissioners in Nevada heard about what he had done and wanted to talk to him about it. And they got together and they formed the American Lands Council, a nonprofit organization, and they hired Ken Ivory to be their president and spokesman and go out and educate. And where the funds are coming from is counties have been joining the organization through membership so that this membership can advocate on their behalf to get local control of the lands and resources. So it's something that the counties realize would be good for their people, good for their environment, good for their economy. And so more and more counties have been joining, and over half the money that's coming into the American Lands Council is through county memberships, and then there's individual memberships, and every once in a while there's a philanthropic donation. There's to date, no great big organizations have funded it. It's been largely grassroots from local counties and citizens and resource experts, and then there's a lot of people willing to volunteer their time and help put things together as well. Bud?
Most of the legislation that I've seen has an exclusion for national parks and monuments, etc. That's not in Article 1, Section 8. So why do these state resolutions or laws exempt or carve out certain of these public lands and seem to be only talking about rangeland and parks?
Okay, so the question is why have we excluded national parks and wilderness from the demanded transfer? Because those lands constitutionally don't fit within Article 8 of the Constitution. We made a policy decision, to pursue the lands that are supposed to be managed for multiple uses, because those are the lands that we need to manage for multiple uses to help our people the most. And we will have our hands full by taking those lands and managing them. So there's not as high of a priority to jump in and start managing national parks, and national parks are operating okay for the most part. So the priority is the lands that are supposed to be managed for multiple use and sustained yield. And that's what we agreed to do to start with. If that works well and if it works better, there might be another generation that decides to operate the national parks on their own too, especially if Congress falters. Utah's piece of legislation did include a provision that they wouldn't pursue the national parks as long as the federal government kept them open and kept them operating responsibly. But if they didn't, then Utah would start looking at the national parks. And I think we would probably see some agreement there. If national parks started being badly mismanaged or closed, there would probably be a movement from the people to try to keep those open through local means.
If there is a constitutional argument, then it has to be a complete constitutional argument. No exceptions.
Well, I can't disagree with the principle that you're focused on, but the legal arguments are more based on specific clauses in our statehood enabling acts that the public lands would be disposed of, and the focus is on the multiple use lands right now. So you're right, but we're just not. It's just not as high of a priority for us to pursue those lands because they're not as high of a priority to our people to be managing those differently. And we also, we don't want the opposition saying, oh, they're going to take our wilderness away or they're going to take our national parks away. Those are very popular places, and so we don't want the folks in the east to get worried about their national parks. They are national parks. We're used to those. It's now part of our culture, and so I think that that's a willingness to compromise. At least at this point.
Over here.
I'm a little bit confused about what constitutes public land. I was under the assumption that all federally managed land was public land, but I think I'm hearing you say that there's a differentiation among public lands, and I'm not sure I understand that.
There is a difference. The federal government controls a lot of different types of land. They have military lands; those aren't considered public lands. They're military installations. Those are Section or Article 8 constitutionally owned lands by the federal government. So military installations, Indian tribal lands, those are not considered public lands. They're under federal control, but they're not considered public lands. Public lands are those lands administered by the public land agencies, primarily Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Reclamation has some public land as well. By the way, the Forest Service made the argument when they said why they weren't paying us our 5%. They said because the Forest Service isn't public land. That was their argument, and so I hope they're going to lose that one. It's a public reserve is what it is, so it'd be hard to argue that it's not public land. It was pretty interesting to hear that argument from the Forest Service, though.
Is there any other questions?
During the discussion about, was it SB 215 in Montana, you had mentioned that the principle behind it was not to sell public lands, to guarantee that, but it didn't say anything about leasing it. One of the problems that, for instance, in Wyoming, is that so many public lands owned by the state are sent out for strip mining, or sold off, leased out for strip mining. But is that part of where you're getting the $14 is from those 5 million acres is leasing land for exploitation?
Thank you for the question. Very good question. The state's public land, the trust lands, are to be managed for highest and best use. That's part of a constitutional mandate. Those lands were actually transferred to the state with those provisions that they would be used to raise funds for certain institutions. Our schools, public schools, our university system, our school for the deaf and blind, our technology college, our veterans homes. Those lands were set aside to make money for those institutions, so they're managed to maximize proceeds for those institutions. And yes, some of them are leased, many of them are leased for farming and for oil and gas leasing. The movement that we're working on now isn't to take the land and put it into state trust land status. It's to keep it multiple use. So basically it's to manage it better, but to allow it to be open for multiple uses. So we wouldn't make as much money as the state trust lands are making, but that comparison shows you that the state can manage public lands and resources and produce revenue, and we do consistently. So if we manage just to break even, that'd be okay with me.
That's at the expense, though, of taking the land that you put into leasing is no longer public land, right? The leaser has control of it, like Black Mesa, when that was transferred to the state for strip mining, people could no longer want it for hunting and fishing or anything else. And the same in Texas. Of course, Texas was not a deal where this federal land was transferred. It was donated land in the Christmas Mountains, 10,000 acres, which the state messed with for a few years until Governor Perry got in a lot of trouble with finances and had to throw a bunch of bond issues. And then he sold off the land so nobody could access it. But the free land that they got was from the Mellon Foundation, 10,000 acres, Virgin Forest. There's hardly any public land in Texas. It was one of the few areas for it. And they were, the agreement with Mellon Foundation was the land be used for the recreation of the citizens of Texas, which lasted maybe 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Right, and statutes can change, and what I would like to do is work on a constitutional amendment in our state constitution that would spell these things out so there are long-term protections in place to ensure that the lands are managed the way that we're saying we want them managed. So I tried to pass legislation for now. There wasn't enough time to try to bring constitutional amendment forward at this point, but I would be willing to bring a constitutional amendment forward to ensure that those lands are going to they'll remain public, that there would be provisions in place to ensure that they're managed and maintained the way the people of Montana would like them to be managed and maintained. And I think that the key is that when the decisions are in the state's control, you have better access to your state legislators than you do to Congress. And right now, Congress controls what's leased on federal lands and what's sold, and the state has no say in it at all. So you have very little voice in what Congress decides to do and who's in debt. Who's in debt? Washington, D.C. is in the bigger debt, so I think there's a greater probability that they're under more pressure to sell or lease or close down the free use and try to earn some money from those lands. There's no doubt that they're looking at trying to do that, and they've tried to pass legislation to actually just outright sell it as well. If it's in the state hands, the people have a lot more influence in how it's managed. And I can tell you that if we don't have to spend our time on the federal bureaucracies and trying to work with those and basically spin our wheels for years in trying to affect federal forest plans or BLM plans, then the citizens can focus on their state government and we can see better results. We did pass legislation this session in Montana with broad bipartisan support to make our state trust lands more user-friendly. We expanded the ability to bring horses in for longer periods of time, to camp for longer periods of time, and that was a freshman legislator that came in, and I sat down and talked with him, and he was interested in the land stuff. He works for the Forest Service, and I suggested that he carry this bill. I had been working on it to make our state trust lands as user-friendly as possible, and he did, and it went through with flying colors. So it was that easy for a young freshman legislator to come in and pass that kind of legislation. Just took somebody focusing on it for a few months to get it done.
I tell you what, let's go ahead and kind of officially break up, because we're supposed to be out of here by 9 o'clock, they say, and have a chance to maybe buttonhole her just a little bit personally. We want to thank you very much for being willing to donate your time to come down here.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot for having me, everybody. I really appreciate it.